I'll now introduce today's speaker. You'll hear from Sarah Mead, the Deputy Superintendent for Early Learning at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. And I will also share information on behalf of Tiara Washington, who is the Program Manager for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Before handing things over to Sarah, I'll walk through our agenda. So first, we'll start with an overview of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We'll then share how the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will work starting in fiscal year 2024. And then there'll be time for question and answers before closing out. And with all of that, I will now pass things over to Deputy Superintendent for Early Learning, Sarah Mead.
Thank you so much, Julia, and good morning, and thank you to everyone who's joined us for this morning's information session. I appreciate you taking time out of your weekend to join us. To begin our session, I'm going to share some background on the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. As a reminder, the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, we can move on to the next slide, is a special fund of the district government created to increase the compensation of early childhood educators who work at child development facilities in the District of Columbia. The program is administered by the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, as Julia noted, also referred to as Aussie. We can move on to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about how the program has evolved over time. In fiscal years 2022 and 23, Aussie partnered with AidKit to disperse supplemental payments directly to early childhood educators. Hopefully, many of you participating in this call did receive those payments, which we are excited have gone to over 4,000 early childhood educators since the program started. I will pause here to remind everyone that there is one more payment from AidKit coming in fiscal year 2023. That payment will be distributed to eligible early childhood educators in September. Eligible early childhood educators should have received a notification from AidKit confirming your eligibility. If you have questions about the September 2023 payment, please contact AidKit at support@ecepayequity.aidkit.org or 202-831-9298. We'll include that contact information in the chat so that you have access to it. I'll go through the results of the Pay Equity Fund so far on the next slide. To date, we've distributed nearly $70 million to early childhood educators through this program. In fiscal year 2022, 3,217 early childhood educators received payments totaling more than $38 million. And in the first 3 quarters of fiscal year 2023, 3,854 early childhood educators have received payments totaling over $31 million, with, as I mentioned, one more payment still to go. We've heard from the early learning community how impactful these payments have been for early childhood educators, and we are excited to be continuing the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in the years ahead. There are some changes coming to how the program is implemented, which I want to talk about today. For more on these changes, I'll hand things over to Julia. Julia?
Thank you, Sarah. I'll now dive into how the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will work starting in fiscal year 2024 and beyond. So we go to our next slide. As Sarah noted, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, Aussie distributed direct payments to eligible early childhood educators through AidKit. The last payment from AidKit will be distributed in September 2023. So that is next month. Starting in fiscal year 2024, Aussie will transition to distributing funds to child development facilities to use to increase compensation for eligible staff. Instead of distributing a payment to early childhood educators via AidKit this December, as we did last year, Aussie will distribute funds to child development facilities in December. and facilities will use those funds to increase pay for early childhood educators going forward. So let's walk through some of the key changes early childhood educators should know about. First, as we mentioned, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, educators received funds from AidKit. Starting in fiscal year 2024, educators will receive funds through their employer. Next, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, all educators and eligible staff types could apply to AidKit for funds. But starting in fiscal year 2024, early childhood educators will only receive funds if your employer opts in to participate in the program. There is not an application for early childhood educators to complete in fiscal year 2024. Employers are not required to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, but they are highly encouraged to do so. If you aren't sure if your employer is participating, please talk with them to learn more. Another key change is how payments are received. In fiscal years 2022 and 2023, educators receive payments from AidKit via direct deposit or a prepaid debit card. Starting in the coming fiscal year, funds will be included as part of your regular paycheck from your employer. So this means that rather than receiving a supplemental payment a few times a year, your salary will increase and you'll see the increase reflected in every paycheck. The exact timing of when you will see an increase in your paycheck may vary based on your employer's payroll schedule and when they opt into the program. So we recommend that you talk with your employer to see when you can expect to see an increase in your paycheck. And then the last change I'll highlight, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, the payment amount an educator received was based on their staff type. Starting in fiscal year 2024, employers that participate in the program will be required to pay eligible staff a minimum salary that is based on their staff type and the highest credential they hold. We'll talk a bit more about this on the next slide. So before getting any further into our presentation, we do want to highlight some key terms that you'll be hearing and what they mean. So first is minimum salaries. Minimum salaries are the salary or wage a child development facility must pay lead teachers and assistant teachers based on their staff type and credentials. These represent a floor, not a ceiling. The exact amount a participating employer pays staff may exceed, but cannot be lower than the minimum salaries. Next is regular paycheck. This is the mechanism through which an early childhood educator is paid by their employer on a regular basis, such as weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, and that usually depends on your employer. Third, we have staff type. An early childhood educator staff type is their role listed in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool, also known as DELT. There are a number of different staff types. An educator's staff type is based on their responsibilities they hold at the facility where they work and their qualifications. If you are not sure what your staff type is listed in DELT, please speak with your employer. And finally, we have highest credential. This is the highest degree or credential that you hold. That might be a high school diploma, a child development associate, or an associate's or a bachelor's degree. As an example, if you have a high school diploma and a CDA, your highest credential is the CDA. As with staff type, this is based on the information listed in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool. So please speak with your employer if you're unsure what the highest credential is listed for you in DELT. And if you've recently earned a credential, please make sure that that information is shared with your employer. As I mentioned when we walked through the key changes in the program, in order to receive funding starting in fiscal year 2024, your employer must opt in to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Facilities that opt in to participate in the program will receive funds from Aussie starting in December 2023 to pay staff higher salaries. This is different from previous years when all early childhood educators employed in eligible staff types by Aussie licensed facilities could apply for funds. It's important to note here that child development facilities are not required to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, but they are highly encouraged to do so. We encourage early childhood educators to talk with their employers to see if they are planning on participating in the program in fiscal year 24 and learn more about their plans for implementation. So what does it mean if your employer chooses to participate in the program? If you are employed at a facility that opts into the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, your employer is required to pay eligible staff at least the fiscal year 24 minimum salaries. Participating employers will include the funds in your regular paycheck if you are employed in an eligible staff type. We'll dive into what the minimum salaries are and the staff types that are eligible in just a bit. But it's important to note that employers are not required to pay eligible staff the required minimum salaries until after they have received their first quarterly funding award payment from Aussie. The first quarterly payment will be distributed in December 2023 to providers who complete the opt-in process by the Q1 deadline. So if your employer is participating in the program, you should ask them when they plan to start implementing new salaries. I'll note one more time, employers are not required to pay eligible staff the required minimum salaries until after they receive their first quarterly funding award payment, which will be dispersed in December 2023 if they have opted in by the first quarter deadline. Next, we'll talk about what it means if your employer chooses not to participate. If you are employed at a facility that does not participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, your employer will not be required to pay staff the fiscal year 2024 minimum salaries. Employers may choose to opt in to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund at any time and receive the next quarterly payment. That means that if your employer does not opt in time for the first quarter, they can still opt in for future quarters. Just a reminder, all employers must comply with the district and federal laws and requirements related to worker wages and hours, regardless of their participation in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. This includes the Fair Shot Minimum Wage Act of 2016, and for childcare providers participating in the district's childcare subsidy program, the Living Wage Act of 2006. We can drop some links in the chat to where you can learn more about these requirements and where you can get support if you have questions from the Department of Employment Services. So now let's walk through what staff types are eligible to receive funds. Child development facilities that receive funds from Aussie must pay eligible early childhood educators salaries that meet or exceed the minimum salaries established by Aussie. For the purposes of fiscal year 2024 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, the following staff types in DELT qualify as an assistant teacher. So those are assistant teacher, Montessori assistant teacher, pre-K enhancement and expansion program, also known as PKE, assistant teacher, and associate home caregiver. The following staff types qualify as a lead teacher, and those are teacher, Montessori teacher, expanded home caregiver, and home caregiver. I will underscore here that the amount of funding your employer receives, as well as the minimum salaries they are required to pay, are based on your staff type listed in DELT, regardless of what you are called at your facility. If you're unsure of your staff type in DELT, please do talk with your employer. As a reminder, again, your staff type is based on your responsibilities at the facility where you work and your qualifications. Just because an individual holds the credentials required for a role does not necessarily mean that is their staff type. For example, if you hold the credentials required to be a teacher, that does not necessarily mean that your staff type is teacher. It's also important to note here that facilities may, but are not required to, adjust compensation for staff in other roles. If you're employed in a staff type that does not qualify as an assistant teacher or lead teacher, such as director, assistant director, or administrative staff, we suggest that you talk with your employer to see if they plan on implementing salaries for other staff types. So now let's walk through the minimum salaries. We'll first start with the salaries for assistant teachers. The fiscal year 24 minimum salaries are specific to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program. They are not the same as the state and federal minimum wage requirements. We know that early childhood educators are paid in a variety of ways. Some of you are paid an annual salary, while some of you are paid on an hourly basis. For that reason, in the slides that follow, we'll talk about both the minimum annual salaries by staff type and credential and the hourly equivalents. If you are an hourly employee, your employer must pay you at least the hourly equivalent salaries listed in these slides, which you may translate into an hourly pay higher or lower than the minimum, or than the required minimum salaries, depending on how many hours you work. First, we'll discuss salaries for individuals with a staff type in DELT that qualifies as an assistant teacher. Again, this will be individuals who are assistant teachers, Montessori assistant teachers, PKEEP assistant teachers, or associate home caregiver. As a reminder, the minimum salary an educator is eligible to receive is based on their staff type and highest credential. For an assistant teacher whose highest credential is less than a child development associate or CDA, for example, if your highest credential is a high school diploma or a GED, the minimum annual salary is $43,865. This converts to an hourly wage of $21.09. For an assistant teacher whose highest credential is a CDA, the minimum annual salary is $51,006. This converts to an hourly wage of $24.52. And for an assistant teacher whose highest credential is an associate degree or higher, including if you have a bachelor's or master's degree, the minimum annual salary is $54,262, which is $26.09 if paid hourly. Employers may choose to pay some staff in these roles and credentials more, but participating employers may not pay them less. Now let's look at the minimum salaries for lead teachers. As a reminder, for the purposes of this program, staff types that qualify as lead teacher are lead teacher, Montessori teacher, expanded home caregiver, and home caregiver. For a lead teacher whose credential is a CDA or 48 credit hours with greater than or equal to 15 hours in early childhood education, the minimum salary is $54,262. This converts to an hourly wage of $26.09. For a lead teacher whose highest credential is an associate degree in early childhood education or an associate degree with greater than or equal to 24 credit hours in early childhood education, the minimum annual salary is $63,838. This converts to an hourly wage of $30.69. And finally, for a lead teacher whose highest credential is a bachelor's degree or higher in early childhood education, or a bachelor's degree or higher with greater than or equal to 24 credit hours in early childhood education, The minimum annual salary is $75,103, which converts to an hourly wage of $36.11. Again, employers may choose to pay some staff in these roles and credentials more, but participating employers may not pay them less. So how much funding will employers receive? To receive funding from Aussie, a facility must opt in to participate in the program. The amount of funding a facility receives is based on a formula that was created for this program. Aussie will calculate the amount of money a facility receives each quarter based on the number of staff at the facility employed in each eligible staff type and their highest credentials as documented in DELT. In addition, the formula takes into account the percent of children enrolled in the facility serves who participate in the district's child care subsidy program. This component of the formula, known as the equity adjustment, is intended to direct more funding to facilities that serve lower income families and communities. If you have questions or would be interested in diving into these formula a little bit more, we will drop links in the chat to the funding formula. And with all of that, we are prepared to head into our Q&A, but before doing so, we'd like to do a quick poll. So please answer the poll on your screen and tell us if you are attending today's call in English, Spanish, or Amharic. And we'll give folks a minute to respond. All right, we'll give folks another 15 seconds or so to respond to our poll. Alrighty, thank you for everyone who responded to our poll. It's very helpful to know all the languages we have attending in today's session. We will now move into our Q&A. Doing a quick. Alrighty. Our first question is about the payment coming in September. So Sarah, will educators still receive a payment from AidKit later this year?
Yes, the payments that will be issued by AidKit in September are for Q4 of fiscal year 2023. This is the last quarter of the fiscal year, and it is the last payment that educators will receive from AidKit. But eligible early childhood educators who have submitted an application to AidKit in the past and been approved or submitted one this quarter will receive payment in September of 2023.
Thank you. Our next question, how will the funds be distributed to educators and when?
Employers that opt into fiscal year 24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will receive quarterly payments calculated using the Child Development Facility payroll funding formula. The first quarterly payment will be distributed in December 2023 to childcare providers who've completed the opt-in process by September 30th, 2023. So the payment schedule is quite similar to the payment schedule on which early childhood educators received supplemental payments in prior years. Employers are not required to pay eligible staff the FY24 minimum salaries until after they receive their first quarterly Child Development Facility Payroll Funding Formula award payment from Aussie. Eligible early childhood educators will receive early childhood pay equity funds through regular pay received from your employer, such as your regular paycheck. Talk with your employer to see if they'll be participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024, and to ask about the timing or plans for when they would implement new salaries or wages.
Thank you, Sarah. Seeing some questions here related to credentials. So if someone has an associate or bachelor's degree in a field that is not related to early childhood education and does not have 24 credit hours in early childhood education, what minimum salary would they be eligible for?
That's a great question. The fiscal year 2024 minimum salaries for eligible lead teachers and assistant teachers, which I want to remind folks do also include home providers, expanded home providers, and associate home caregivers, are based on both an educator's role and the highest credential they hold. And I want to underscore, this is the highest credential related to early childhood education or with early childhood credit hours that is reflected in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool. For example, if you are in a staff type that qualifies as a lead teacher and you have a bachelor's degree in a field that is not related to early childhood education, and you do not have at least 24 semester credit hours in early childhood, you would qualify for the minimum salary for a lead teacher with a child development associate credential, not the minimum salary for a lead teacher with a bachelor's degree. Similarly, if you have a staff type that qualifies as a lead teacher and you have an associate's degree in a field that is not related to early childhood education and do not have at least 24 semester credit hours in early childhood, you would qualify for the minimum salary for a lead teacher with a child development associate credential. Early childhood educators who need support in pursuing education credentials, including those who have a degree but need additional credit hours in early childhood education specifically, are encouraged to visit the Aussie Early Childhood Education Resources webpage to find information on programs and available supports. You may also contact the ECE Help Desk for customized support. We could drop links to those resources in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll flag, I'm seeing a number of questions here about the specific staff type someone might be eligible for in DELT, or how to upload credentials or determine what credentials someone actually has. I will encourage all of those folks to reach out to your assigned licensing specialist if you are the director or owner operator of a facility. If you are an early childhood educator, please speak with your employer. With that, I will go into our next question. And this is a question related to taxes. Are educators required to pay taxes on the money that they receive in fiscal year 24?
Yes, thank you for that question. So starting in fiscal year 24, you will be receiving payment if your employer participates in this program through your regular pay from your employer. And since your employer would be the one who's paying you these funds, they will be required to withhold taxes and other required withholdings from your paycheck, just as they do now for the pay that they currently provide you for FY24. I do want to underscore that, as we've communicated in the past, the fiscal year 23 payments do not have taxes withheld from them, and you may want to consult with legal and tax advice related to those payments. Because individuals' tax situations are different, we cannot tell you how either the 23 or the 24 payments will affect your tax liability, and we would suggest that you consult with a tax specialist if you have questions about that. When we get into tax season next January and February, Aussie will share resources on free tax advising services that may be available to early childhood educators in the district, Maryland and Virginia, and encourage you to consult those resources if you need to.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next question is, what if my employer cannot afford to pay me the minimum pay wage increase?
Yes, so that is a great question. I want to underscore that employers do make the decision about whether or not they want to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. All licensed child development facilities serving children 0 to 5 are eligible to participate, but it is the employer's decision whether to participate. If an employer chooses to participate, they do need to commit to pay the minimum salaries, and Aussie will monitor that they do so. It's hard to speak generally to your question because cannot afford could mean a variety of different things, and we don't know how your employer may or may not be reaching that determination. However, Aussie realizes that because this is the first year of the program, some employers may face challenges in meeting the minimum salaries or need help to know how to comply with the requirements. In the first year, our goal is to work with and support childcare providers while also monitoring compliance to ensure that funds are used for intended purposes to increase staff pay. So we do encourage employers to participate in the program, and we will be providing additional resources, information, and supports to help them meet the requirements.
Thank you. Our next question, what is the last day for a child development facility to opt into the program?
Yes, so there are sort of two pieces to the answer to this question. As we've shared earlier on this call, the first payment to child development facilities will be distributed in December of 2023. In order to receive that payment, a child care provider must apply to participate in the fund by September 15th and submit a completed agreement by September 30th. I do want to be clear that submitting an application does not obligate a provider to participate in the program. The provider needs to go all the way through submitting the agreement in order to be a participant in the program. However, even if a program does not meet the requirement to receive payment in December 2023, they can still opt in to the program, but they would not receive payment until the quarter after they opt in to the program. So if your employer doesn't opt in to participate for December, they could still opt in to participate for March. If they don't opt in to participate for March, they could still opt in to participate for June, and so on and so forth.
Got it.
I will also note that this applies to new programs that are opening. So if a new program opens, they can still apply. They just will not receive the payment until the quarter after they submitted an agreement.
Let's see, our next question is about an application. So is there an application that early childhood educators need to complete?
That is a great question, and I know it's a little bit confusing because we have been working with you on the applications that educators do need to submit to AidKit, but once this program launches, early childhood educators will no longer need to submit those applications. Employers or child development providers must apply to participate in the program. That is the organization that owns, operates, runs the facility. Since we are distributing payments going forward through child development facilities, early childhood educators will no longer need to apply for funds. I do want to note that if you are a home or expanded home provider, and you are both an early childhood educator and the owner of your facility, you will need to submit an application if you want your facility to participate in the program, but there is no longer the kind of application that needed to be submitted to AidKit.
How is Aussie monitoring or making sure that employers are paying their eligible staff the minimum salaries?
That is a great question. So Aussie will monitor the compliance of all child development facilities participating in the Pay Equity Fund. This will include reviewing documentation, such as payroll records or other similar documentation, showing that employers are paying their staff who are eligible at least the required salaries. If employers are found not to be paying their staff required salaries, they will be subject to corrective action and will receive technical assistance to support them in meeting the requirements.
A lot of questions around how long this program will go on. So is this a permanent change for the way that the program is operating, or is this just for fiscal year 2024? Could you speak a little more to that?
Yes, thank you for asking about this. The program is established as a special fund of the District of Columbia government, and it does not have an expiration date. All of the programs that Aussie operates are subject to district and federal laws that could change in the future, but we are implementing this program on the assumption that it will continue going forward. And unless there is a legislative change, it will continue. The change that we're describing related to ending distribution through Aid Kit and starting distribution through child development facilities is intended to be the long-term state of how this program operates. We do anticipate that because this is a brand new program, we may need to make adjustments or changes to parts of it in the future, including, for example, the formula through which funds are distributed or the minimum salaries, but the distribution through facilities is how we expect the program will continue to be implemented, and any changes will be communicated with the early learning community with significant advance notice.
Thank you. Another question. So we know that DC has a mix of providers. So we have child development centers, child development homes, expanded homes. Can any type of facility participate in the program?
So any facility that is licensed by Aussie and serves children ages 0 through 5 can participate. Facilities that provide only out of school time to school-aged children are not eligible to participate in this program because it is intended to increase compensation for early childhood educators. Child development homes can participate in the program, as can child development expanded homes, and will receive funds through the same funding formula that is used for child development centers. If you are a home or an expanded home provider, you will need to submit an application for your facility to participate in the fund. Home and expanded home providers are counted as teachers in calculating the funding formula awards that go to participating homes and expanded homes, and associate caregivers employed in the home are included in the formula as assistant teachers and should be paid according to the assistant teacher salary or wage for their role and credentials. Aussie will also be monitoring the compliance of homes and expanded homes that choose to participate in this program.
Our next question is related to the minimum salaries. So will the minimum salaries remain the same for every year to come, or will they be adjusted? Could you speak some more to that?
Yes, this is a great question. Aussie is required to review the minimum salaries every year and submit a schedule of proposed minimum salaries to the DC Council, along with what it would cost district government to operate the fund, supporting those salaries. We will publish minimum salaries for the coming year in spring of each year. So it is entirely possible that salary amounts may change year to year. They are not necessarily automatically indexed to inflation, and any changes will be made with significant advance notice to the early learning community.
Another question, can employers make lump sum payments like Aid Kit has been doing for the past year or so?
No, employers are not permitted to distribute these funds through lump sum payments to employees. They are required to incorporate the funds into increased regular pay for their employees, whether that is an annual salary or an hourly wage, and to distribute those funds through your regular paycheck.
And if someone's employer does not want to participate in the program, so they do not opt in, can early childhood educators who are employed at that facility register on their own?
No, after September, funds will only be distributed through child development facilities.
Um, Another question, and I think this might be similar to the question we had earlier on monitoring, but who is ensuring that employers are providing these funds to their workers?
Yes, as I mentioned previously, Aussie will monitor compliance of all child development facilities participating in the Pay Equity Fund. This will include reviewing documentation such as payroll records or other similar documents showing that employers are paying their staff at least the required salaries by role and credential type. Employers who are found not to be paying their staff required salaries will be subject to corrective actions and will receive technical assistance to support meeting the requirements. We will be sharing more specific information about monitoring and monitoring requirements as we move forward with implementing the program this fall and winter.
And I'm seeing some questions about how exactly Aussie is determining the amount of money a facility receives. Maybe we could go back to the last slide there. And Sarah, could you just speak a little bit more to the funding award amounts?
Yes, so consistent with the legislation creating this fund and the recommendations of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Task Force, Aussie is distributing funds to child development facilities through a funding formula that's similar to the way that funds are distributed to schools that receive public funding as public DCPS or public charter schools in the district. However, while those formulas for DCPS and charter schools are based on student enrollment, the formula for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund is based primarily on the number of eligible educators employed in a facility by staff type and by credentials. And that number comes from licensing information submitted through Aussie's licensing data system, also known as DELT. So the base of the funding formula is how many eligible early childhood educators by role and credential a facility employs. We then adjust those amounts based on the percentage of children served in a facility who are enrolled in the child care subsidy program. That is based on subsidy enrollment as a percentage of the facility's licensed capacity. And the intent is to direct more resources to facilities that may be serving more lower income children and communities, because we know those facilities may have less access to resources and may need more resources to support the needs of children that they serve. Those factors combine to generate a total award amount that will go to the facility to use to pay salaries for their staff.
Thank you. Let's see. A question around if a early childhood educator changes jobs. So what happens if you change jobs and start working at another facility?
Yes, so first it will depend on whether the old or the new facility participates in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. So if you are in the job market, that is something you may want to talk to prospective employers about. The minimum salaries are based on your role in the facility and your credentials. So if your role is the same and your credentials have not changed, the minimum salary an employer participating in the fund would be required to pay you stays the same. If you are moving to a new role, that could affect your eligibility to participate in the fund. For example, if you are moving into an instructional coach role, you may no longer be eligible to participate in the fund. Or if you're being promoted from an assistant teacher to a lead teacher when you change jobs, that would also change the salary you're eligible for. But if you're in the same role and you have the same credentials, the minimum salary that your employer is required to pay you may stay the same. Again, employers do have discretion in setting salaries as long as they meet the salary minimums. So it is possible that your salary may be slightly different from the minimums, but the minimum that they are required to pay you is the same for all employers based on role and credentials if they're participating in the fund.
And I'm seeing a number of questions here from attendees who say, I have X credential, I work in X staff type, what is my salary? What's the best advice we can give those people?
So I think there's two pieces of advice. One is if you are uncertain what your role or credential in the Division of Early Learning licensing system is, please consult with your employer. We know that facilities use a variety of different names to refer to staff in their facility, and it is important to note that the minimum salary you are eligible for and the amount of funding your employer will receive are based on your title as in the licensing system, even if it is different from what you are called in your facility. Similarly, as we heard earlier in the call, the minimum credential that determines the salary you're eligible for and how much your employer receives is also based on the credentials that are listed in the licensing data system. And it does matter whether those are early childhood specific credentials or not. So if you have questions about your specific situation, please consult with your employer. I think beyond that, we do have schedules of the minimum salaries by role and credential type published on the Aussie website. And I think we had them on one of the earlier slides, and we can share that information with you. You can find that on our website.
Thank you. A question here. I think this is looking for some clarity around what the funds are actually being used for. So are the funds for these programs to augment teachers' minimum salaries, or are they funds to help facilities go above the minimum salaries that have been established?
That's a great question. So the funds are designed to increase staff compensation. If the facility is currently paying their staff less than the minimum required salaries, they need to use those funds to bring their staff up to at least the minimum required salaries. I want to be clear when I say minimum required salaries, I mean the minimums that are established by Aussie for this program, not the minimum wage. All child development facilities as employers in the district are required to adhere to district and federal minimum wage laws. If you believe your employer is not following federal or district minimum wage laws, please contact the Department of Employment Services about that matter.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we've covered a majority of the topics that have popped up in our chat today. Thank you, everyone who is submitting questions. I will reiterate to folks that you can send questions at any time to the Pay Equity Fund email address. We will make sure that is included in the chat. So we'll drop that in. I think with that, we'll move to close. And before closing out, we do want to share some tips for early childhood educators to prepare for the changes that are coming to the Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 24. So our first piece of advice is to talk to your employer. Ask them if they plan to participate in the program in fiscal year 2024. And if they plan to participate, ask when staff can expect to see their salaries increase. Second, we encourage you to confirm your staff type with your employer. Your staff type in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool is based on your responsibilities where you work and your qualifications. If you're not sure of your staff type, do talk with your employer. And then third, make sure your information is up to date. If you've recently achieved a new credential, make sure you've provided your employer documentation of that credential so they can upload it in DELT. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who has joined today's information session. For more information on the fiscal year 2024 Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, please visit the Aussie website. We can include that in the chat. We also encourage you to review the FAQs for early childhood educators. These documents answer a lot of the questions that we've heard from the early learning community. And then finally, if you have questions about the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund for fiscal year 24, please do reach out to us. We've included the email address in the chat, but that is aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov. And with that, I would like to say thank you one more time for everyone taking time out of their Saturdays to join us. A recording of this session will be made available in the coming days. We will send that out via email and have it posted on the Aussie website. Thank you, and everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.